Back during the pandemic, Japan labeled My Hero Academia, Jujutsu Kaisen, and Chainsaw Man as the Jump Hell set, because the three of them were going through gigantic climaxes that served as turning points for the rest of the series to come. These stories, however, feel like they are crashing and burning after they make it out of their turning points. Chainsaw Man less so because I think its circumstances are a bit different. The Control arc is more like a series ending than a turning point if you ask me. Some series like the aforementioned MHA, JJK, or perhaps even Undead Unluck have these gigantic, climactic moments and the content after it is, well, not particularly good. That doesn't mean that there can't be highlights or good moments, but it feels like the series moves ahead at a pace that it can't keep up with, and the frame of the car flies off along with it, exposing the mechanical parts underneath that kill immersion. I want to focus primarily on Jujutsu Kaisen here, because it's a series I kinda shoot a lot of strays at, and I decided to reread the whole series this month, including reading Modulo for the first time so I can talk about it at length. I've already discussed why My Hero Academia's war arc was, in hindsight, a problem child, and now I think it's Jujutsu Kaisen's turn, specifically the Shibuya incident. Though I do think there is a difference. The future of My Hero Academia ends up nullifying a lot of the interesting plot direction that MHA's war arc offered, whereas Shibuya, even on a reread, still delivers on everything in it, but strips the narrative bare. I know that both PLW and Shibuya should not necessarily be considered war arcs, but that's often what fandom calls them, so that's what I call them, just so that we're on the same page. Even though both of them are less like wars and kind of just battles. To begin talking about Jujutsu Kaisen, I think it's ideal to break it down into three sections: Pre-Shibuya, Shibuya, and Post-Shibuya. The rise, the climax, and the fall. I know to a lot of people who have had agenda take over their minds, the prospect of calling the Post-Shibuya content the fall is quite a terrible claim, but I hope you can keep your eyes and ears open to hear my perspective. What made Pre-Shibuya feel so different? Well, that's a difficult thing to answer because if you ask me, it's everything. Down to the characters, the pacing, the fights, and the power system, but we can break it down one by one. Shibuya and Pre-Shibuya marks the period where I was the most invested in the characters of Jujutsu Kaisen. I wouldn't say it was extremely high, but it gets the job done. It gives one enough time with some characters to develop strong bonds with them. Particular standouts would be Yuji, Gojo, Megumi, Nanami, Mahito, and kinda Maki. I'm not going to say that Jujutsu Kaisen hits all of its characters out of the park because I don't really think it does. It feels like some characters get consolation prizes. If you maybe get a sad panel or page, you're supposed to like them, like Mekamaru vs. Panda, both of whom I can never give a fuck about at any point in time. Or you just get a strong moment and we're expected to become invested in their journeys, like Momo and Nobara, except I lied. They don't have a strong moment, even though 2020 anime-manga discussions would have you think otherwise. Some characters are anomalies and have insane merch amounts and popularity like Inumaki, but such is the fandom life. Some people confuse any amount of screen time with quality and depth, which is how characters like the aforementioned or others like Kamo, Miwa, or God forbid Junpei have shooters. Obviously this take is going to be subjective and some poor Inumaki fan is glaring at the poster of him in their room in frustration, but sincerely, that is how I feel. While the majority of Jujutsu Kaisen's cast isn't particularly moving, I must say the ones that were mentioned earlier a bit really do stand out and tall above the crowd. Maki Pre-Shibuya is the one toughest to fit into that list, but I've always felt partial to her, primarily because I vibe hard with stories like hers and Gojo's, which are about sticking it to the previous conservative generations that only seek to protect themselves in a selfish method of self-defense and sell out the future because of it. She had been essentially expelled from the Zenin clan, one of the three great clans of Jujutsu society, because she was born without cursed energy. On the flip side, someone like Gojo, who was born with it all, holds a very similar mentality to Maki despite being of elevated status within that Jujutsu structure, and I think that's something that is seriously enjoyable about him. He is what one could say is the exact opposite of what you would imagine as the golden child of Jujutsu. All talented, extremely hardworking to develop his skills, the prodigy born every century or whatever, and yet he's so relaxed it's comical, and above all else, his students come first. It's this ideological struggle that informs much of Jujutsu Kaisen, and of course Gojo's character. The conservative older state apparatus that acts in self-defense is full of cowards and cheats. The only reason Gojo hasn't used his power to slaughter all of them is because it would lead to no fundamental change. Jujutsu Kaisen has a lot of lingering threads of messages, so it's hard to pin it down to just one. But the one I've seen that I agree with the most is that JJK is about curses. Well, duh, dude, no fucking shit, but more importantly, it isn't about the curses they fight nor the sorcerers, it's primarily about the curses that plague everyday life. Whether it be ideologies or trauma, or something you can think of that fits under the umbrella of a curse, like the curse passed down to our protagonist, Itadori, to help people. Itadori is by far my favorite character in JJK. Someone afraid of dying, afraid of death, afraid of killing, afraid of hurting people, but more than that has the overwhelming desire to save people, to let people die in the best way possible. I think when discussing Itadori's character, people often neglect his character introduction, which has him in an occult club rather than a sports club, something he would be far more suited to. However, what sets Itadori apart at the very start of JJK is that he does not live how other people expect him to. He lives in a way he wants, which shows how deeply the final words of his grandfather afflict him. This isn't to say that Yuji isn't interested in saving people. I don't believe he's purely motivated by that curse alone, and I do think he does genuinely and authentically want to save people. However, Yuji believes that his role is to be Sukuna's vessel and to die when it's all said and done. Itadori begins to live inauthentically when he makes that decision to fulfill the role that was set out for him, while still engaging in acts he feels are just and moral by saving those in danger. This inauthenticity, and also fear of the deaths of others, is juxtaposed by his first big obstacle, Mahito, who I think is a fantastic antagonist. Mahito is someone who can only live authentically to himself. Being a disaster curse born from the fear of humanity itself, he is of the belief that life has no weight or value. Like how water flows through the earth, life simply flows, meaning without value. Do what you want, live the way you want, don't limit yourself to indifference. If you're hungry, eat. If you hate, kill. That is where the two become ideologically opposed. A difference in living true to oneself and the other filling in the role assigned of him. Of course, there's more to it as well, but we can save that for the Shibuya section. Megumi and Nanami are both characters that are cursed by the circumstances of being a sorcerer. Megumi follows his conscience, which often leads him to put others before himself, and views himself not as a hero but a sorcerer. He will not do things because they are right or wrong, but he will do what his heart wants. Unlike Itadori, however, he does not feel an overwhelming desire to save every single person. For example, what if someone you save ends up killing someone in the future? Megumi is full of inner conflict, about his role in this world as a sorcerer, about his familial history, about his lost sister, about good guys and bad guys, about how to use his life, and so much more. Gojo points out that Megumi is willing to sacrifice himself, while people like Yuji and himself are always willing to swing for the fences. Megumi is the type of guy who will win by dying, instead of winning even if you die. Nanami is someone who was also a victim of this world. He's stern, here to identify the truth and uphold the law. Working is idiotic, and so is being a sorcerer, because it's a line of work where you must accept those around you will die. But as an office worker, he felt alienated from the cycle of human life. He didn't exist to help others, to make someone else's day a little bit easier, but to turn a profit. Even the girl who works at the bread shop provides value, so he became a sorcerer. JJK's cast is actually not insignificant. A majority of them don't do much, but the ones that do are pretty good. They all in their own way encapsulate Jujutsu Kaisen's core messages of curses, and these characters are ones that aren't necessarily impacted by the pacing. The pacing is pretty much the most common complaint about Jujutsu Kaisen in both halves, but I would say pre-Shibuya it's manageable. Sure, things come and go pretty quickly, but we also get lots of time to develop relationships, personality traits, and such. Since pacing is the most frequent complaint about the series, I figure it would be a good idea to talk about it a bit more. Pacing is the speed at which a story is told, which might sound counterintuitive because speed is a visual concept. Some people think of examples like time, a complaint often brought up about My Hero Academia because it all takes place in one school year, but I don't think that really matters. Pacing, or speed, is determined by the events that take place within. The length of said events, how fast the action moves, how quickly the reader is provided with info. An author might feather the bricks of the story to allow for much needed characterization, something we see with silly scenes like Ozawa bumping into Nobara talking about her crush on Itadori. It might be done for world building, like when we learn the very little information we get on the sorcerer clans. It could be done to establish future plot points, like after Yuji dies and we learn about the binding vow he and Sukuna made. You can also slam on the gas to hit a climax of the story. The obvious elephant in the room is Shibuya, but again, we'll get to that later. Overall, in my personal opinion, good pacing is a cohesive balance between fast and slow. Too slow and some readers might become uninterested. Too fast and readers might struggle to build investment in your story and characters. I think, largely, JJK is a bit too heavy on the gas. This can be felt through Junpei in my exceptionally controversial opinion, because I don't think he's particularly good as a character nor as a tragic loss, but I do think his death is good for Yuji's character. He frankly feels like the biggest psyop of all time, placed in the OP in thousands and thousands of bot tweets talking about how cool that is, when you actually aren't given any substantial time to feel any connection between Junpei nor his relationship with Itadori. I know a lot of people aren't going to agree with that, and that's fine. I imagine to a lot of you this is going to inform a lot about how I feel about JJK's characters. People even in my own Discord give me grief about this, stating that the series is good at concise and hard-hitting story arcs. I think they often take the best examples and run with them, ignoring all the times they don't work. It's like the plain survivorship bias image. A lot of the time before I make videos, I also tweet, "Is there anything you would want me to talk about in this discussion?" And I also got a comment saying that same thing, but no, I don't take that as truth. People have been blinded by Higuruma, who is of course very good. JJK's best are characters that are dangled throughout the story, progressively built upon, or given setup and eventual payoff. This pretty much includes the entire aforementioned list, except Megumi. Another thing that gets Jujutsu Kaisen a lot of grief is that its high pacing leads to a lot of fighting. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding here, however, about the purpose of fights. Fights in battle shonen, or really any story, do not inherently mean that all character work must stop. We all love Yuji versus Mahito for a reason. The fight should not be done solely for spectacle. Okay, actually, some of them, some of them can be purely respectable because they're fucking awesome, but not all of them. There is absolutely nothing stopping somebody from having character work done in fights. It's a silly criticism that gets levied at JJK primarily, as if series like Kagurabachi aren't dropping fights with thematically rich messaging in the middle of high-paced combat. As if the much-loved Yuji vs. Higuruma doesn't exist in this very same manga. As if MHA Act 3 doesn't... okay, you know what? Yeah, that one does actually suck ass.
#1 K9 English teacher.
Characterization, progression, ideological conflict, development, and more all happen in the fights of Pre-Shibuya JJK. You can wish more non-fighting happened, I'll be right there with you, but fighting does not preclude the possibility of progress. This is especially apparent with early JJK's implementation of its ever-famous power system. Cursed energy is capable of a lot, and I think that is utilized really well in early JJK. The only thing that is fair about life is how unfair it is to everyone. That is a thought from Megumi that is pretty much integral to cursed energy as a power system, and it's relevant in spades. It's explicitly stated that your capabilities with CE are about 80% innate talent. The very concept of Black Flash and how it does not choose who to bless, and how those powers also can lead to suffering of their own users. It's an inherently unfair system, in an inherently unfair society, in an inherently unfair world. But even with something unfair, there were still hard rules that applied to every sorcerer. It was interesting watching the way that all these characters interacted with it, through their manifestation of cursed energy, to their innate techniques, to reverse curse technique, simple domain, binding vows, Black Flash domain expansions. There was a fundamental rule set that underlined all of it, and none were exempt from it. I would say early JJK's power system does indeed deserve some of the hype it gets. It's inventive, it's fun, and also, I haven't read Hunter x Hunter yet, so it's still shiny to me. It leads to interesting battles, interesting mechanics, and as explained earlier, an interesting exploration of characters through these powers, like Megumi and the Ten Shadows technique, and how badly he wants to fucking kill himself, or the obvious Gojo and how Infinity makes him feel the isolation of the strongest. Or Yuji, and him punching and kicking really hard. Really, I think Yuji is a great way to use the power system for the themes of Jujutsu Kaisen. That Yuji was unfortunately given the role of Sukuna's vessel, more or less against his will, and cursed to save others, yet despite his importance and his status, he is not given any unique ability. No deep-seated curse technique, poor curse energy manipulation, though admittedly he does have his insane physical stats, but you get what I mean. He has not a Jujutsu golden child like Gojo, but so much of the world and so many lives still sits on his shoulders. The one thing he does have in his kit is Black Flash. Can I say something controversial? Well, you know what, I've already been doing this throughout the whole video, so maybe a bit more doesn't hurt. Black Flash is kinda lame, man.
Guess we're all thinking stuff, huh?
It's introduced as something nobody can control, and it's supposed to permanently alter your relationship with cursed energy. So, of course, Yuji hits it on, what was it, the second try? As soon as it's introduced into the story. The thing you can't control, by the way. I know that Black Flash isn't actually random because it's a story, but I think I would appreciate it more if it actually came at times that felt thematically enriching, or at the peak of a climax or character arcs. Most Black Flashes in this story feel like a cop-out, but I digress. What I do think Jujutsu Kaisen would have benefited from is not purely focusing on the strongest like it ends up doing. Yuta, Gojo, Yuji, Megumi, Sukuna, etc. I think there's a treasure trove of stories that could be told about some of the less fortunate characters in this story, maybe like Miwa, or the attempt at Mekamaru. This doesn't mean we can't take a look at the strongest like JJK does. I'm not even saying it has to undo what it did. It could have just benefited from more. Seeing how these characters not given strength navigated this world, but there might be more to say about that later. Pre-Shibuya JJK is solid. It has a lot going for it. Was I wrong when I said that I never had JJK above a 7 out of 10? No, I still don't think so. It's good, but nothing crazy. October 31st, the Shibuya incident. This is an arc I came to enjoy even more on a reread. I've always enjoyed Shibuya, but the reread seriously hit. The climaxes, oh the climaxes. The events that take place on Halloween are slowly sprinkled throughout the story, built up as we become more familiar with the world and the characters until you truly see just how much is at stake. Jesus man, I don't even know where to begin. It's a complete status quo shift. The state of every character and every plotline is either, well, ended or permanently altered. A character like Maki has her entire trajectory altered. We have a character like Nanami who has a great conclusion, grieving his feelings of uselessness and working to save people without unloading a curse onto the next generation. Even Toji runs it back again for some fucking reason, but it works, as Toji sees Megumi not being restricted by the Zenin family. The bombshell reveal about the true nature of those stitches in Geto's forehead, a central antagonist in Kenjaku, and of course, the sealing of Gojo. The sealing of Gojo is obviously a tremendous deal, and the Yo Satoru moment is awesome. Gojo, a dark humor enjoyer who realized he was hanging with a real racist, was pushed to become the strongest, and that question of, are you the strongest because you're Satoru Gojo, or are you Satoru Gojo because you're the strongest, pretty much distills a lot of his character. A question of identity based on his position. What comes first, Gojo himself or that absurd power? The man's very birth altered the balance of the world, and because of him, curses and sorcerers were kind of put into an arms race to improve. There's an isolation in that, and taking advantage of the shambling corpse of his one friend, or boyfriend, let's be honest, to incapacitate him is cinema. The man who tipped the scale simply by birth causes not just a society-wide shift, but even a shift in the goals of the arc, as the mission becomes to drop everything and save Gojo right fucking now. His existence is one that shifts the game board basically no matter what he's doing, even while sealed, as he sits back and wishes for the next generation to take things from here. But it goes to show you how distant or alienated Gojo can feel from the concept of being considered a fellow human when his sealing shifts the goalpost this much. It sets him up for greatness to come. His reactions to the events of Shibuya, to people lost along the way, and the possible inner conflict that can come from Gojo being sealed, and all of the events of Post-Shibuya even being allowed to unfold because of his sealing. We have tremendous and awesome fights like Yuji vs. Chozo, which then leads directly into Sukuna vs. Mahoraga, as Megumi tries desperately to find any opportunity to kill himself, but Sukuna won't let him, planting the seeds for greatness as we see just how far Sukuna is willing to go to protect someone he's interested in. Of course, Yuji is an absolute standout of Shibuya. It is our first consequence of living in a post-Gojo world. So what makes it funnier is that the events of Sukuna's Shibuya rampage come quite literally right after Gojo was sealed. The second his presence is gone, Sukuna is unleashed, and he and Jogo battle to the death, causing untold damage and destruction. Sukuna is a character that speaks about strength-based hierarchy in his introduction, and supposes strength above all else. Abandon the identity that lays underneath to only focus on reaching the heights of Gojo. He tells Jogo that trying to become a true human is foolish. Constantly comparing yourselves to those around you stunts your growth. He speaks similarly about how Mahito wishes to live life, telling him to burn everything he wants, and even calling Jogo strong. At first, he was just a door dasher for the fingers, but he proved himself in Shibuya to be a formidable foe. Of course, nothing compared to Sukuna, but still, he was strong. This comes after basically being immediately emasculated by Gojo, calling him weak, a tale of the two strongest giving conflicting answers to Jogo. Simultaneously, he was criticized by Gojo, who was actually more similar to Jogo than might be seen on the surface. Perhaps that's why their names are so similar. Or maybe Gege is just silly. The disaster curses yearn to build a life for the next generation of, quote, true humans, end quote, using their strength, which is exactly what Gojo intends to do with Jujutsu Society. Sukuna punishes him for this brutality. If Jogo had abandoned this collectivist progressive idea of the next generation, he could have stood alongside Sukuna as one of the strongest, but he couldn't. So, while he was strong, Jogo still had something incompatible with the true strongest identity. So when his ego is stoked by Sukuna and he cries tears, Sukuna has no idea what those are, killing him with his flames of his own to further incinerate even Jogo's ego, because Sukuna has no need for things like ego, pride, identity, or goals. He lives true to himself and lives true to his strength. Since nobody can beat him, that seems to be the correct ideology for him. After Sukuna vs. Mahoraga in Sukuna's domain, an untold number of people are slaughtered, which is when he lets Itadori take control again, and he's hit with those words that haunted him from Megumi all those chapters ago. What would you do if someone you saved killed a person? Itadori Yuji had been saved, and now thousands are dead. Not only that, but he was forced to confront Chozo, and Yuji killed his brothers. Shibuya is when Yuji's resolve is not just defeated, but entirely broken. The ruined remnants of what was once a person kept crying, wishing for his own death, and following this up with Nanami's death and Nobura's thing, he's completely empty. And then Mahito really sticks it to him by saying that he and Yuji are exactly alike. This may make no sense on the surface, but he explains it a bit more later. Just like how Mahito lives true to himself, killing without a second thought, Yuji's way of living true to himself is to thoughtlessly save people. In an arc in which identity is discussed so much, albeit implicitly, this inner battle for Yuji is quite the important one. Gojo being seen as an otherworldly being and dehumanized, Jogo not letting go of his identity to stand with Sukuna at the top, Chozo's identity as an older brother, the identity of Zenin, and now Itadori Yuji, the one who shed his own personhood. As long as he lives, those that they have lost are never truly defeated. What has he been entrusted with? As a Jujutsu sorcerer, he will take on enemy suffering. He will cast away the identity of Itadori Yuji and live as a sorcerer, as Sukuna's vessel, as a cog in the machine. While Mahito learns, evolves, gets stronger, and finds the shape of his very own soul, Yuji also comes to a conclusion of his place in this world, and it's that Mahito is right. There is no meaning. He will kill Mahito, and that is all his role is. An unfortunate amount of people view this as a positive development for Yuji because of rawness and swag, and well, undeniably there is rawness and swag. This new mentality of Yuji's is in fact a step backwards, however. Every time Yuji fails, he takes another step away from his true self. Mahito was just a fantastic antagonist, and while I'm sad to see him go, fuck do I appreciate what he gave us. There's something so fire about the curse being the one to grow and evolve, whereas Yuji is in the process of stagnating and rejecting growth. This also serves as another shift from Shibuya. All of these climaxes and conclusions, we're kind of left wondering, well, what do we have left? Yuji is on a much different trajectory. Megumi is Megumi. Nobara is, dead. Gojo is sealed. Geto is no longer among us, Kenjaku has been introduced, Nanami is dead, Maki is MIA, Mahito is dead, Jugo is dead, Hanami is dead. A majority of our cast is kind of missing. And I think this poses the first hurdle that Post-Shibuya has to get over. I know people don't give a shit about characters like Hanami or Dagon, but that's because the story never really made you care. And now that door is closed forever. Unless they're Toji. Mekamaru, Nanami, Nobara are removed from the story and those potential plotlines or advancements are gone. Sorry for the use of the word potential, I know that's loaded in this community. Of course, these characters being gone isn't automatically bad, I'm just saying that it's a closed door, and now Gege will have to work to not even open new doors, but construct them from the very foundation and up. Considering our list of characters I was truly invested in just fell dramatically. The Kenjaku reveal is interesting, but he's not Geto, so we're starting from square one. Maki's trajectory is uncertain, but she also wasn't a strong character to begin with. Megumi has been on the back burner for a couple of arcs now. Yeesh, is that it? I guess we have Yuki? Post-Shibuya JJK has a lot of potential worries that it has to tackle, a lot of barriers that it has created for itself that we now have to see how it approaches, and well, given the framing of this video, I think it's probably clear to those watching at home that I don't think it really does clear those hurdles. It leaps up, it hits its legs on them, and tumbles to the ground along with the hurdle. In the JJK community, it has become the popular opinion that culling games is better than Shibuya. To me, this feels like a knee-jerk reaction to statements such as, JJK peaked with Shibuya, rather than a genuine appreciation for post-Shibuya content. I'm also not stupid enough to think that nobody believes that would be silly to assert, but in my humble opinion and perspective, the idea that post-Shibuya is better than Shibuya is unfathomable. While the state of our characters has shifted so much, and while our societal status quo has shifted a ton with it, Jujutsu Kaisen also feels like an entirely different series, and I don't mean that positively. It feels like someone chasing the consecutive high after high they might have felt while writing Shibuya, an arc that deals with climaxes. Writing climaxes is fucking awesome, and I don't want to stop writing those, so my story is now all climax. All bust, no stroke. What made Post-Shibuya feel so different? Well, that's a difficult thing to answer because if you ask me, it's everything. Down to the characters, the pacing, the fights, and the power system, but we can break it down one by one. Having stripped most of its cast away, Jujutsu Kaisen was tasked with doing a lot of good stuff with the people we have remaining, and introducing new characters into the mix. With the exception of Yuji, who I still think is good, JJK largely fails at both of these metrics. A majority of the characters introduced post-Shibuya are, well, gimmicks. I'm going to exclude Higuruma from any and all of this criticism because I seriously do think he's awesome, but the rest, well, more or less, yeah. We get an introduction to Yuta, who I do like and appreciate, and Naoya is alright, but we're immediately thrust into the Zenin massacre, something that at the time of its release was largely criticized for its insane pace. Even in the anime, which made people wonder what the anime did to the material, but no, the arc was just like that. Characters like Mai serve the other issue with the characters post-Shibuya. If they aren't gimmicks, then they are so unbelievably backloaded that they ring emotionally hollow. I like the Zenin massacre, I like the messages that it sends, I like what it does for Maki, but Mai's death, well, I was not impressed. This lends itself to what I discussed even pre-Shibuya, where even back then a lot of the cast weren't necessarily standouts, but with somebody like Mai, all of their content is thrust in front of you and you're expected to emotionally resonate with it. I didn't. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that this was even present with Mekamaru, a character who suddenly gets a couple chapters dedicated to him being a traitor, and the tragedy of his life like I was ever made to care about him in the first place, outside of one brief fight with a fucking panda. However, Jujutsu Kaisen seemingly believed that it had done enough in its first half to make character moments feel earned in the second, despite not actually building any emotional connection with anyone present. Thinking that a scene with the principal being executed by the state is going to move me because even pandas cry, it's scenes like Mai, Mekamaru, Panda, and Yuki that tell me that the series feels like it has satisfactorily connected us to this cast of characters that we barely get any time with, and expects me to feel moved by their deaths or hardships, and with the deaths of Mai and Yuki, JJK continues to whittle away at the pre-Shibuya cast it had left standing, and as characters like Todo basically never show up again. The characters we get to fill the void of Shibuya are, in my probably hot take, resounding failures. Hakari does not impress me. Kirara does not impress me, and also never really on screen again. Hakari is also just a funny character to me. He's such a flop for a character that was touted for his importance, and it was even matched against Urame, who is a character that is like instrumental to the human aspects of Sukuna, a character continually compared to Yuta and Sukuna's right hand, they-them, only for their fight to be entirely off-screen. Rin, Remy, fucking Reggie, Hana, Ryu, Uro, Charles, Kashimo, Daido, and Neo, 2 names I had to Google by the way, are all either exceptionally dull and uninteresting, or at best, mildly interesting, but effectively never utilized again. Hana is intriguing, but effectively only exists for a crumb of Megami content, and to give Yuta a technique. Ryu and Uro were fun to read, but Uro appears in like a couple of panels later, and Ryu does nothing besides getting his head split open by Sukuna. They more or less fulfill the gimmick portion of my criticism, and all of them are about as deep as What's something shallow? Air? As mentioned previously, Higuruma is exempt from this list. Also kinda Takaba. Higuruma felt like a very, very idealized character. Gege surely had a strong vision for this guy. A man who fell in love with the concept of proper justice, protecting the innocent and punishing the guilty. But being from a nation with a 99.9% conviction rate, he was forced to witness firsthand the real inner workings of the justice system, before running into Yuji and seeing someone who is truly not self-motivated, who truly wants to save people, and is effectively his idealized justice personified. Characters like Megumi, Gojo, Kenjaku, the Principal, Kusakabe, Miguel, Todo, Inumaki, all of these characters that existed pre-Shibuya are all exceptionally backloaded. Meaning, they get no content, until they do, and that's all they get. They're done. Did we count Miwa in that? Jesus Christ, I forgot about her until just now, until reading this. Because of that, they just don't work. I know it's a hot take. Megumi's depression arc is just a flop, man. His sister is such a fucking non-character despite being his motivation, that it leads all of his suicidal ideation and conclusion to live Ring so completely hollow. And when you see Megumi and Sumiki finally interact again in the Culling game, it's so bad that I actually felt insulted for being invested in Megumi early on. Megumi's rejection of Yuji and Yuta's domain just feels like an exceptionally unearned character moment. Not that I oppose the moment on its face, I think that's fine. I went into this Jujutsu Kaisen reread specifically attempting to re-examine the Megumi content because of how powerfully people hoist up this depression arc. It's underbaked and underdelivered. He's not even an active player in his own depression arc, which could be arguably the point, as that's kind of the nature of depression, but due to how undersold his relationship with Sumiki is post-Shibuya, and how he's removed from the story at the end of the Culling games, all we have to work with are a couple of scattered panels. Even something like the vessel of Sumiki's death at the hands of his cursed technique is unexplored in its entirety. Okay, sorry, there's a page of him looking sad. Tanking domain expansions, taking the bath, Gojo's death with his own body as well. You're not at any point made to emotionally resonate with what Megumi is going through. You're told that he's going to be depressed, and then he says he is, and then the fight keeps going. I'm not opposed to Megumi giving up. I think that's a cool character direction. The issue with that direction is that you have to actually turn to go that way. JJK tells you it's going to go in that direction, but never actually turns the car around. Gojo, well, I'll talk about him in a bit. Kenjaku is effectively a non-character. He has this big reveal on Shibuya, doesn't fucking do anything, fights Yuki, and then gets one-tapped by Yuta and Takaba and just concluded. Huh? Oh my goodness, Kenjaku and Yuki. These two are absolute disaster classes of characters. Their fight has interesting packaging. They're two characters who both have ideas about how the world should go, what to do about cursed spirits and such. Unfortunately, outside of this core concept, Yuki isn't much of a character. The only female special grade, and just like her ancestors before her, she's immediately fridged as soon as she becomes relevant, because Gege Akutami graduated from the school of Kohei Horikoshi writing. She does have a cool fight that I appreciate, but as a character she is largely unexplored, something I think even most strong JJK fans would agree with. Especially with the addition of her being a star plasma vessel, like 15 seconds before she explodes. More offensive than her to me is Kenjaku. This character is genuinely incomprehensible. I don't actually have an issue with him fighting Takaba. I think the setup for this fight is clear. Kenjaku is a guy who does things he's doing just because. He wants to see what happens. Maybe it'll be funny. Takaba seems like the logical main fighter for him. People defend Kenjaku because he's evil for the sake of it, and not all characters have to have deep motivations. I agree with this. All for One pre-MHA lobotomization is a prime example of this. The difference between Kenjaku and AFO is that AFO actually does stuff. Kenjaku makes his grand reveal and basically has no impact over the manga again. We get some setup with Kenjaku literally being Yuji's mom, something that never comes up again and the two never meet again. We have some setup with Kenjaku being in Geto's body, how Geto fights back in Shibuya, and how Gojo is obviously not happy with his friend's body jacking. This never comes up again. He is so hilariously uninteresting and underexplored that when Yuta cuts his head off, once again, in a confrontation that was set up and barely paid off, I assumed that there was not a chance in hell that Kenjaku was actually dead. Whoops. A character that was to some the final antagonist, or at least one of them, has a fight that didn't resonate with a lot of people, though I personally enjoy the fight itself, before getting one-tapped by Yuta and Todo, and that's it. Through Takaba, we at least got to deliver what was ultimately Kenjaku's goal, to see the Chaos, a sorcerer that was created by Kenjaku's use of idol transfiguration, and a technique that is fundamentally fucking insane and unlike anything he has ever seen. This is cool stuff, but it does not fix the lingering threads of what Kenjaku could have been before his untimely demise. Kenjaku is just really lame to me. The principal Yaga is barely real until he dies. Kusakabe is barely real until he 1v1 Sukuna. Miguel is barely real until he fights Sukuna. Todo is not real post-Shibuya until he fights Sukuna. Inumaki is barely real until the sword jack moment where everyone gets to contribute to the final arc. Post-Shibuya JJK is a revolving door of characters either being poorly disguised plot devices or having one potentially solid moment before they die or the story ends. And just to clarify, I don't use plot device as a term much for criticism, because all characters are plot devices, that's just how they work. The issue with plot devices isn't that they exist, it's that when you can tell they exist on their face in the form of characters. When the set dressing comes undone, the curtains collapse, the lights pop, and the mics have feedback. You lose your immersion, with it your investment. This isn't so bad once or twice, but that's all most post-Shibuya characters are. Like, Yorozu existed to have this small plotline about Sukuna's love, and then to give him the rattle so that he doesn't get insta-killed by Higuruma's domain. And, okay, let's not get started on Nobara, okay? I don't think anyone would enjoy going down that route. Okay, let's go down that route. Nobara's return is, in my humble opinion, probably the worst thing the series has ever done. Fridging this character, who frankly did not have enough content to make me invested in her death either, sorry Shibuya, and then dangling the keys in front of you that she might be alive for 4 entire years, before bringing her back at 11:59 on the Doomsday Clock, is genuinely awful. Over 100 chapters of not getting to be able to be a character, trying to make us feel something with Yuji's fucking, oh man, I'm so worried Hana might replace Nobara, a panel that still makes me roll my fucking eyes to this day, and then having her come back at the very end, and specifically writing it so that she literally just woke up, all so she can land one of the final blows on Sukuna is outrageous, and like the previously poorly disguised plot devices, makes it glaringly apparent that Nobara was fridged because otherwise Sukuna was fucked. If the fight started at like 6 p.m. instead of like lunchtime, everyone might have lived. Such is life, I guess. Gege was in a real damned if you do, damned if you don't position with Nobara, a character you allegedly killed but alluded to returning. If she's for real dead, then what the fuck was the point of dangling the keys? If she's for real alive, every single chapter makes her time gone from the story even more glaring and even more terrible. I like Yuji. I like his domain expansion, and his conflict with Sukuna, and his reconciliation with the value of life and what his role in this world is. Realizing that humans aren't tools and they don't have roles, it's good stuff. I like Chozo, though I do think the timing of his death is kinda funny, and especially how Todo returns immediately after he dies. I actually liked his death on a reread. I didn't when I first read this arc, but coming back to it, I was moved, with Chozo dying to protect the legacy of his life as a human in Yuji. I kinda like some other characters too, but to talk about this next part, we really gotta dig into what I think is JJK's Achilles heel. And frankly, a lot of JJK fans would probably even agree with me on this. The pacing. It's an issue that plagued the series at large, and instead of taking the time necessary to pick the pieces of the narrative back up after Shibuya and laying off the gas for a moment, the series wastes no time at all, stepping even harder and harder and harder. Because the narrative never stops, we don't get that many character interactions. We don't get that many scenes of reactions that we need to see. We don't get that much bonding that relationships would greatly benefit from. I said earlier that I overall like Chozo, and that's still true, but I do think that JJK would have been strictly better had we had the time to stop and give him the opportunity to live as a human for longer than 15 seconds. It's why outside of Yuji, I have a hard time excitingly going, yeah, I like this character. And shit, Yuji's a victim of the same thing. His content is just really good. All of his power progression in Shinjuku is off-screen and the solution to his cog mentality just kinda appears. He's still the best character in JJK though, don't get it twisted. But this pacing is largely what feels responsible for Jujutsu Kaisen's backloading. And when it isn't backloading, it's just moving so fast that we don't actually get the time for character moments that would mean something. It's what makes us feel a bit distant from the Zenin massacre, from Megumi's depression arc, and his relationship with Sumiki. It's what makes the Sakurajima colony feel super weird and rushed, as Maki is placed in a domain that basically lets her evolve in one chapter. It's what never gives Kenjaku an opportunity to be a character, to never give more time to Yuki before her death, and it's what leads to JJK's second biggest mistake, the time skip between Culling Game and Shinjuku, in which all of the preparations and happenings between our characters are all resolved off-screen. The biggest victim of this being a character I do think was largely good, Satoru Gojo. His unsealing seemed like a big deal, but it wasn't, because we cut straight to Shinjuku, and he gets cut straight in half. A throwaway line for Nanami, a single line about his regret for being sealed, and having the events of Shibuya happen. Nothing substantial to say about Geto being piloted by Kenjaku, nothing really to say about Megumi, the guy he's known since he was an elementary student, now being taken over by Sukuna. Nothing on the events of the Culling Game, Tsumiki, not a thought at all, before he's cruelly sent straight into the Shinjuku fight. It feels like unintentionally, JJK gives into the in-universe characterization that Gojo is a spectacle, not a person. There's a valid interpretation that this is intentional, that these people aren't respecting Gojo's humanity and sending him straight to war. But considering that after this death, his story just sort of ends outside of Yuta claiming he won't let Gojo be the only monster, it seems that Gege inadvertently agrees with the assessment that Gojo is just a spectacle. Nobody mourns his death. His friends and borderline family are indifferent outside of reaction panels. His body is desecrated by Yuta, which amounts to no concrete conclusion, because it's undone and played off as a gag. Gojo's relationships, goals, and characterization were stripped away to hype up and get to Gojo versus Sukuna. The natural response to this criticism is that due to the urgency they were placed in the story, they simply did not have the time necessary to give these characters the content they needed. This is a good argument, if you believe that stories are real, that they actually happened. that they are not the whim of a god, known as the author. Gege was the one who decided that the situation was so perilous after Shibuya. Gege was the one who decided to not give these characters the time they needed, to crank up the pacing even more and to jump from point A to Z in a page turn, to make character interactions and relationships feel so hollow that he was seemingly under the assumption that "I'm afraid Angel will replace Nobara" is in any way an earned moment when they have interacted like 3 times. And funnily enough, despite JJK fans vehemently and correctly disagreeing with the notion that JJK has bad character work because it's nothing but fights, they unintentionally end up agreeing by saying the stakes were too high to slow down and give characters, well, character. Because pre-Shibuya JJK was perfectly capable of giving robust and good moments in the middle of a fight, so let's talk about the fights post-Shibuya. Fights in JJK, just like every story usually, serve a function. To establish our power system, to establish characters, functions of the world, to give characters powerful moments for their arcs, or start them on new ones. Post-Shibuya feels like a fundamental shift, where we're now putting up a majority of fights purely for spectacle. And unfortunately, pure spectacle is not something I enjoy most of the time. There are some exceptions. Yuji vs. Chozo is not a particularly deep or meaningful fight, but it serves its function in establishing relationships and plotlines while also being sick as fuck to watch. Culling Games and Beyond feels more akin to watching action figures slam together, and we can roll up the power system section into this one as well, as the series spends a gratuitous amount of time indulging itself in its power system and getting high on its own supply, with exposition mechanics. The Zenin Massacre is a victim of Jujutsu Kaisen's half-baked character implementation and pacing. Yuji vs. Yuta and Chozo vs. Naoya is a fun-to-watch transitionary fight, but it doesn't do much beyond that. Hakari vs. Yuji and Megumi vs. Kirara is a fight that focuses on the mechanics and has little character work. Some characterization for our new characters and a benchmark for where Yuji is. Megumi vs. the guy covered in fucking receipts is a fight that almost feels skippable outside of one panel about Megumi's shadow, as the series puts the mechanics of the fight before the contents of it. Sendai Colony is indeed a fucking awesome spectacle with some solid Yuta characterization, but considering how all these characters are effectively fodder, it doesn't actually accomplish much. Hakari vs. Charles is an exposition dump for 2 characters we're basically not going to see much of for the rest of the series, so that Yuta can get a precognition technique against Sukuna, and so Gege can have fun with his action figures. Hakari vs. Kashimo is genuinely my least favorite fight in the series. If you removed it, would it serve any purpose? I genuinely couldn't tell you. Hakari's power is a complete flop of a gambling ability that is the world's least interesting implementation, and Kashimo is not a character, and oh, he's gone. A pure spectacle fight, perhaps not a problem on its face, but this is spectacle after spectacle after spectacle, with character we don't know, character we don't know, character we don't know. Power system explanation after explanation after explanation. Even in the third to last chapter of the whole story, we spend most of our time talking about power system mechanics and new Shadow style lore. Are we serious, man? JJK wants to shove down your throat repeatedly, at the expense of all of its characters and narrative, the mechanics of this power system and the intricacies of every little thing. But we'll also do a final time skip so that everyone can have some insane, unsatisfying power upgrades, and if that doesn't work, well, that's fine. You can just use a binding vow. The supposedly deeply fleshed out and complex power system could just have a binding vow slapped on top of it if something isn't working the way you want it to, and that's fine. You don't have to actually discuss what was exchanged in most cases, you could just say something happened. You also never have to show the breaking of a binding vow, because nobody would do that, unless it's in a mobile game. They are your fix-all for any issues with any fight you're writing. So the answer to what feels so different about JJK, well, the answer is everything. The characters, the pacing, the fights, the power system, it's all different except the themes. Something I respect about JJK, even at its lowest, is that it never really abandons its primary message. I would say that this is a unique strength of JJK over some other shonen. A story about the fundamental unfairness of the human experience, and how some people thrive in spite of it, or how some people seek to abuse that. A story about how even if you think you've gone too far, someone is willing to help pull you out of the darkness and help you put you on a path to redeem yourself. Ultimately, death will come for us all. Our lives in that way are very, very much like the snow that Yuji is such a fan of. While he was obsessed with that endpoint, the snow melting on the ground, and giving it a proper send-off, the Sukuna fight and seeing his comrades fall is what helped him realize that life is not just about death. There's far too much in between to be purely fixated on the conclusion. A proper death could be important, but what's more important than that is a proper life. And sustaining a proper life includes forgiveness. It includes carrying others when they fall. It includes being surrounded by those you love and care for. It includes making memories that will carry on with your friends and family. And most importantly to JJK, it includes instilling the following generation these values of love and compassion. This is one of the main threads of Gojo's character. Someone who should be idealized by the older generation, deeply despising their self-centered, hedonistic ideals and wanting better for those who come after. To end the over-reliance on people like Satoru Gojo, and to cultivate individual strength so that not everything falls on the shoulders of one, but the shoulders of many. It's a message that seems at odds with the collectivist messages from earlier, but it truthfully isn't. It's a balancing game, where it's good to have individual strength, but an individual should not carry the burdens of the world. And capturing the fleeting nature of life, Jujutsu Kaisen, despite being constantly called a dark and gritty story, I would say is quite a hopeful one when it's all said and done. Be there for each other. Help each other break the bonds of generational trauma. Help lift up others when they fall, don't focus on the conclusion, and enjoy the ride. Like snow falling from the sky. Which is why even though I don't really like most of Post-Shibuya JJK, I can never say that I hate JJK or anything like that. Even through its faults, it stays true to itself until the very end. Even with its lackluster characters, breakneck pacing, gratuitous fights, and self-indulgent power system. So perhaps it's not exactly fair to say that everything is different about Post-Shibuya JJK. It sticks to its guns. Another thing that ended up changing though was the fandom for JJK. I first picked it up right before Shibuya even started, and by extension before Season 1 had started airing. I watched the fandom slowly twist itself into the hive of villainy and insecurity, forever mad at people who don't enjoy the thing they like. Because of Jujutsu Kaisen's perception as a series that is, quote, purely about fights, there is a heavy knee-jerk reaction where people feel overly protective of the series and must intellectualize every single aspect that is present, asserting a deep understanding of Buddhist themes because they skimmed a Wikipedia article. A Japanese series having Buddhist themes, that's a big shocker. Writing threads and asserting an inherent profoundness in something as surface level and widely understood and utilized such as religious text. To be clear, JJK absolutely pulls from Buddhist imagery and ideas. That much is especially clear for characters like Gojo and Sukuna, and to assert otherwise would be uneducated and dishonest. The primary issue is that religious symbolism alone is not depth. Referencing Buddhism does not automatically make a work more profound, any more than referencing Christianity or Greek mythology would. Themes must still be executed, developed, and emotionally realized within the story itself. But for a lot of Western anime manga fans, Buddhism carries this aura of automatic sophistication because it feels culturally distant and less familiar. So instead of analyzing how effectively JJK uses those ideas, people treat the mere presence of Buddhist themes as proof of intellectualism on its own. Criticism is then automatically dismissed by the notion of you not actually deepening the Buddhist messaging, because it wasn't that you actually engaged with it critically, it's that you failed to comprehend this tiny, intimate hidden layer that only the true fans can get, because they read more gooder. I'm reminded of a time in the MHA fandom when people with too much free time decided that MHA fans weren't good enough, and so they made the distinction between MHA fans and MHA enjoyers. An embarrassing and childish temper tantrum thrown by people in their mid-20s that serve to further ingratiate themselves with the other auto-fillators as not just fans of a piece of work, but in a way to claim ownership over it, because they are the only ones who actually understand the work, not the spiteful, critical fans who obviously have no joy or whimsy. The inherent defensiveness and combativeness of the Jujutsu Kaisen fandom was also exacerbated by perhaps the biggest drain in form of pestilence that has ever been released into a fandom, Mayamura. A hilariously out-of-touch troglodyte who was one of the most interacted with accounts on the entirety of Twitter because he leaked every single chapter of the manga before its actual release, coupled with poorly taken pictures of the magazine and Google Translate quality translations. Absolutely devastating the reading experience for potentially millions of people and creating an archetype of dipshit freak who only reads the manga from his dogshit pictures and translations without ever reading an improved translation at any point. I empathize and understand JJK fans' anger and frustration towards Mayamura and the irreparable damage he has done to JJK's perception and community. Mayamura and wannabe sophists simply created one of the most toxic anime communities of all time. If the obvious tonal and stylistic shift of Post-Shibuya JJK didn't work for you, it's because you're illiterate and didn't grasp the themes or whatever. And in some cases, these people were actually correct, because the person they'd be speaking to skimmed Mayamura leaks in 45 seconds and didn't actually engage with anything present before starting to agenda post about Hakari versus Yuta. What makes this insane juxtaposition of Jujutsu Kaisen so interesting is Modulo, the sequel series. It's a short manga, and I figured if I were reading JJK, well, there's no reason to not pick up Modulo. If Pre-Shibuya into Post-Shibuya is a whiplash of quality, then Modulo serves to further snap your neck. Modulo was a good read, like, really good. I was impressed for, well, almost the entire time, until the ending. We spoke about how the characters, the pacing, the fights, and the power system all felt so different between the two eras of JJK, and much is the same for Modulo. The characters are pretty solid. I don't know if I would put any of them in my top characters list or anything, except Maru, that's the GOAT, but they're enjoyable. The dynamics of the siblings are enjoyable. I like Tsurugi, Yuka, Cross, and Maru. Dabura is another cool version of the strongest that Gege seems to enjoy writing about. The characters aren't next level or anything, and there are a lot of characters that are kind of surface level, but given Modulo's length, I think it's fine, because we put focus on the cast that really matters, and funnily enough, I would say when we go to characters from the previous series is when the cast is at its weakest. Nobara doesn't really do much, big shocker there. And you know what, I would say the stuff we get from Grandma Maki is actually pretty good, but Yuji, he's a mixed bag for me. Yuji is not Yuji from JJK. He's gloomy, kind of, sort of depressed, and forges a path that misinterprets Gojo's teachings. That part I do think is cool in concept, but I do think it's kind of strange to even see Yuji be so far from his base principles, like letting Yuka be Earth's representative to fight Dabura to the death at the cost of her own life when she is like 15, and has cancer. Naturally, this is a consequence of Yuji's long lifespan, and having watched everyone he knows and loves die around him. He's become jaded and has had a long time to stew on the teachings of Satoru Gojo. Yuji being the new Gojo is quite apparent through the way he's portrayed. The strongest existence who also has his eyes covered like he's once again lost his identity, similar to his Cog mentality from before. It's complete character regression, which isn't something I dislike on its face. I mean, I'm a ReZero fan after all. People reject this notion because Yuji is raw now, but no, Yuji in Modulo is not in a good state. He ended up just like Gojo, isolated and exceptionally powerful, but also taking it a step further by trying to instill strength in the next generation by not stepping in when the time calls for him. Who even cares about Yuji Itadori, he says. The same thing Gojo said in Shinjuku about himself. The difference being that Gojo, like in the Hanami fight with Yuji and Todo, considered stepping in but saw that they were holding their own just fine. Yuji does not do this for Yuka, and it almost reads as out of character. Yuta poured his cursed energy into a ring that he gave to his grandchildren, a tool to watch over them until they grow enough, informing the first conflict of the story between Tsurugi and Yuka. Tsurugi wants to get strong enough so that he doesn't need it, something that Grandpa Yuta intended, where Yuka misses the point of the ring and wants to get strong so that she can deserve it. Yuji didn't want the world to rely on him like they did Gojo, but in doing so, goes much too far and potentially causes more harm before the Deus Ex Machina of Maru's technique. Again, I don't really have any issue with this on its face, and I in fact think someone misinterpreting Gojo's will is actually really cool. What I don't enjoy as much is Yuji's regression, primarily because it just feels so out of nowhere. Since we don't see the 68 years between JJK and Modulo, the things that Yuji had endured, and what may or may not have shaken his ideology and moral compass, the fact that it comes out so different doesn't make it that satisfying to read. I'm not really gonna knock anyone for liking it because the pieces are there, I don't know man, it just doesn't feel like Yuji the character that I enjoyed. The pacing, until the end, is also a notable improvement. We get a lot of time to flesh out our main cast and their dynamics. I like seeing them interact doing things like the cultural exchange with the aliens, it's fucking awesome. The slow buildup of the cultural or religious conflict between Earth and the Sumerians was really nuanced and good to read. The fights in the power system didn't feel like they were indulging themselves for the sake of it, but felt pointed and designed specifically to handle character arcs and conflicts. The ending of Modulo is weird. Really weird. Maru's curse technique can just kinda do anything and solve the issues of the conflict in a chapter or two, which I find super fucking bizarre. I know a lot of people are mad that Dabura and Mahoraga got off-screen, but while I do think that's funny, I also don't really care. The really weird thing about Modulo is how it's presented as a conflict on basically culture. To summarize, the central conflict between the Rumelians and the humans is that Rumelians come from a tribe that views animals called Kalians as godlike figures. They are animals native to their planet that prey on everyone except for Rumelians. On Earth, the Rumelians see humans killing cursed spirits, and this is the primary driver of conflict because to Rumelians, cursed spirits are seen as almost analogous to Kalians in many ways, but also different in others. When cursed spirits are killed, and also by extension Kalians, Rumelians are put under intense physical pain, which causes their third eye to cry, something that's awful for them to endure. Yuji and Maru, independent of any nation-states or their planets or their respective groups at large, come to a conclusion all on their own. Rumelians, cursed spirits, and Kalians all have the same, quote, color of the soul, end quote. So Kalians and cursed spirits were inherently, biologically, and naturally not hostile to Rumelians. They make use of Mahito's idol transfiguration to change the soul color of all future cursed spirits and Kalians, which will in turn make the Rumelian god figures hostile to future generations. It is framed in the story as a necessary sacrifice for cultural integration and immigration. In exchange, humans also give up cursed energy and any and all future opportunities that may come with that. I think when you're doing an allegory for immigration, and the answer has anything to do with biology or something innate to the people, you get into really weird territory. I'm not going to call Gege a secret member of the Fourth Reich because I don't think that's really his intention if the messaging of Jujutsu Kaisen as a whole is anything to go by. It's inadvertently like eugenics or bioessentialism, and feels especially weird that this decision was made for all people of both planets against their will. Especially when the message is supposed to be that for immigration, both cultures have to give up things to coexist. There's a few issues with this concept if you ask me. First of all, we're attempting to portray this as an equal compromise, which it isn't. The Rumelians are losing a cultural and religious pillar, whereas humans are losing potential economic profit from cursed energy, equating a deeply spiritual cultural touchstone with economic gain. In my opinion, if you're writing an allegory to a social issue and solve it with something biological or immutable, you enter really weird territory really fast, especially when you equate groups of people with soul colors of what are portrayed as animalistic beasts. Now, I'm a white American. I have no skin in the game for the erasure of my culture to integrate into a society, but having spoken to immigrants about this very plot beat, they echo much of the same sentiments. Primarily that they are tired of immigrant representation in media telling people to just suck it up and become a part of the new culture. That the struggle becomes holding onto a culture while adjusting to a society that doesn't fully accept you. And this can kind of work for Modulo, but the allegory is fundamentally changed because their godlike figures will now be hostile to future Rumelians. Again, I don't think this is an intentional message from Gege, because he does not seem to be exactly fond of the status quo of Japan, but it's a powerful reading nonetheless. If you guys have a disagreement with my interpretation of the soul stuff, that's valid. It's not something I'm married to, and frankly, would love to be talked out of, because it's an icky message for an overall good manga. I would say even despite the messy, rushed ending, I'm more favorable towards Modulo than JJK as a whole. I talked about JJK for way too long, man. Jesus. This script is 22 pages of talking about a series I'm not really a huge fan of. I enjoyed Pre-Shibuya JJK, not to a crazy extent, but I had a good time with it. Shibuya is still, I think, one of the best shonen arcs I've ever read. Post-Shibuya is, unfortunately, a continuous stumble of what feels like self-satisfaction and self-indulgence at the expense of some of the series' greatest strengths. Prioritizing cool double spreads and walls of power system texts, sacrificing coherence and core themes, a vague gesturing at comments about the world at large and the status quo, and showing an obvious distaste for it without having much of substance to add or say about it, so that we can see Hakari do a funny dance. Botch dynamics or Sukuna, really not trying yet. There are still things to enjoy, things to talk about and dissect, and even though this video is far too long, I'm sure I didn't get into something that you might have wanted to hear. These are my personal thoughts and ideas while rereading Jujutsu Kaisen. A strong 4 out of 10. My rating unfortunately remains unchanged on reread. There are some things I appreciate more now that I've gone back, and some things I feel more distaste for. Such as life. Modulo is probably like a 6. As always, I will implore everyone to prioritize their own experience. My rating is just my rating. I'm not going to recommend or, what's the opposite of recommend? Dissuade you from reading JJK. Maybe you'll think it's 10 out of 10 peak fiction. You are free. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, make sure you subscribe for more. You can also check the description down below to become a member, which gives you benefits like early videos, membership badges, and cool custom emotes. You can join the Discord where we talk about Re:Zero, Kagurabachi, Jujutsu Kaisen, and all kind of stuff. Additionally, you can go to the channel store and pick up some awesome stickers made by our channel artist, so you can carry the power of Graphia with you on your water bottle. That's about it though. Thank you for watching. See ya.